Welcome to the Emerging Biotech Leader, where we help biotech leaders maximize the value of their therapeutics from translational development to product launch. We're your hosts. I'm Kim Kushner.
And I'm Ramin Farhad. We are here to help you navigate the pitfalls of the biotech industry and illuminate the path forward.
Welcome to today's episode of the Emerging Biotech Leader. Today, we're so excited to welcome Marshall Summar, the CEO and founder of Uncommon Cures. We're going to be talking today about the challenges of study design, and when we're talking about rare disease, the intricacies that we have to deal with as we're thinking through this rare disease population and the different groups that we're trying to engage. Marshall, thank you so much for joining today.
Kim, it's a pleasure to be with you, and I really appreciate the chance to talk with you and your audience today. My name is Marshall Summar. I've been in the rare disease field since about 1985. A lot of it on the clinical end in the academic world, and then for the last 3 or 4 years, actually in the other side of that, doing clinical trials as a business at Uncommon Cures. Probably done somewhere north of 200 plus rare disease clinical trials during my career at all different kinds of levels. So I've gotten to see it from the bottom up from that standpoint. And it's great to be here with you today.
Amazing. Can you tell us a little bit about what Uncommon Cures is, and in particular, what differentiates you from a typical CRO or other groups that are supporting these studies?
I get that question a lot. So what is Uncommon Cures? It's actually an idea that came out of discussions with Janet Woodcock when she was commissioner at FDA, Andrew Lowe, an economist at MIT, myself, and a few others. And we were looking at the rare disease field, and we were noticing some tapering off of investment in new companies, new products, things like that. And we looked at it, and what we realized is we were trying to apply a somewhat inefficient system, one designed for rare disease drug development, to very, very small drug development. And the model wasn't fitting as well anymore. I think the early days when the returns on investment were quite high, we're starting to taper some. So we needed to look and see if we could build a more efficient system. So what Uncommon Cures is, it's actually an end-to-end. We do the aspects of the CRO, but we also have the physical site, the physicians, nurses to conduct the studies. We have study design teams. We have pharmacy. We have project managers. So we can actually take a rare disease project from its very earliest days all the way to the post-marketing phase and conduct that as well, too. One thing we particularly like doing is we spend a lot of time with clients on study design, trying to get them the most efficient one that is going to give them the highest chance of success, and that's using models specifically designed for the rare disease community. So in a nutshell, that's where we are. We have our physical location here in D.C. We also have contract sites around the globe in Santiago, Chile, Utrecht, Zurich, the Emirates, South Africa, and places like that, so that we can actually bring in a broader scope of patients when we need to.
And when you're thinking about bringing in these different groups of patients, the number one issue I find that organizations are struggling with in rare and ultra-rare disease is patient and family engagement. And thinking through, you just described the fact that you have sites really all over the world in order to try to engage them where they are. But how are you managing that intricacy? You have language barriers, you have cultural barriers, you have fear of the diseases that we're talking about and misunderstanding of them depending on the medical infrastructure that we're working in each one of these different geographies. So how is Uncommon Cures, in your background, how are you addressing some of those systemic barriers in addition to some of the infrastructure pieces that you've developed?
Well, it really starts with engaging the patient population. So anyone who's doing rare disease clinical trials who is not working either with the patient advocacy groups or the patients in what other organized fashion they have, you're really missing the boat and you're really setting yourself up to not do very well. So we start there. The next thing we do is it comes around design. You want to build what are called parsimonious designs around rare disease. You want to have as few patients as possible to get the signal that you need for that, which means use different statistical models, things like that. So it starts on the front end by trying to design for using as few patients as possible. Next comes actual study design itself. One of the things we do is we work with both the patients as well as our nursing staff and physician staff to look at each trial design and say, is every single thing that's in here have to be here? So, it's kind of like when everyone packs for a trip, they always pack, they pull out twice the number of things they need. And then they try to stuff it in a suitcase. What we do is we look at all the things you might think you need, and then you drill it down to what you absolutely have to have. So you decrease the burden as much as possible. The other thing is keep patients at home. One of the things that we learned from COVID is the clinical division I was running. We did a lot of telehealth, a lot of telemedicine, and we learned there are very few things you can't do by remote. You can send folks to a home to draw blood. You can get a decent physical examination. You can actually observe patients in their home environment, which is often more accurate than in the clinical setting. So we try to design trials and we try to run trials such that the patients come in absolutely as few times as possible. In some of our trials, they never cross the doorway. Drugs are shipped to home. If something needs a physical presence, we'll send a nurse to the home, and then we'll do the rest of it by remote, including consent and everything else. Now, the next issue you bring up is language barriers, cultural barriers, things like that. And those are different in every single area. Now, one thing, there's an issue you have to consider when you're doing a clinical trial for rare disease. You don't want to start something you can't finish. So if you're doing like a small molecule trial or something like that, you probably don't want to recruit patients from a country where that drug's not going to be available long term. So one thing we'll look at is this a one and done? So like a gene therapy, something like that. It's very ethical to do that. And usually we'll bring those patients in, we'll fly them in, put them up, and do things that way, and then arrange follow-up when they get back home. For some conditions, though, you really have to look at, is this ever going to be a drug marketed in this country? Because it's not really fair to a family to start them on something and then, pull that away. So there's a bit of an evaluation around that as well, too. And the rest is getting good translators. One of the nice things about being headquartered in Washington, D.C. is we have access to very good translators. And we're starting to look now at some of the AI options for how do you, create materials in a lot of different languages, things like that.
Marshall, I was thinking about this. My career has also been exclusively in rare disease and ultra rare disease, and really been lucky to end up in this space. But one of the things that I was thinking prior coming on this episode was the rare disease now is growing. There's significant investment behind it. Depending on what data you look at, there's 1/3 of clinical trials are designed in rare disease. There is more than half of the approvals are also in rare disease. But the success rate is still very low. Why is that? Is that the science? Is that the clinical trial? I know we talked about recruitment a little bit. What do you think? Where is it that's still broken?
Well, I've observed the same thing you have, and I wouldn't say that there's something broken. We actually have been doing a data dig on that, and so this is some new information. We went back to the year 2000 and pulled every trial in clinicaltrials.gov and then filtered out the oncology trials, because that really is a different field, and then filtered out all the non-rare and ended up with about 5,000 trials to look at. The overall failure rate, once you get to phase 2, is running around 70 to 75%, which is actually better than the norm for other conditions. Now, one thing that's a little hard to parse out, people usually don't say why they didn't succeed, but we've kind of been able to tease that information out. And we're looking at thousands of trials, so the data is pretty solid. Looks like about 60 to 65% of those are because of recruitment and retention. And that comes back to study trial design. Right. We're still seeing a tremendous number of double-blind placebo-controlled trials being pushed forward in disease groups that have few patients. Now, there's another trend that actually builds on what you're talking about. If you look at the early days of rare disease clinical trials, they were still in diseases like cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia, hemophilia, where there were thousands of patients. If you look at the data from Orphanet and some other groups on rare disease prevalence, about 80 to 90% of rare diseases have, just in the U.S., fewer than 150 patients. So what's happening is we're studying these more uncommon conditions we're still trying to use models, or people feel they're forced to use models that do not fit the numbers for those populations. So if you actually look, the failure rates actually inched up some as because of that. And one of the things Dr. Woodcock and I've been working on, and some others, are actually getting a series of papers out, and we've got some coming out in Clinical Translational Science on actually what are better fit models, such as patient, his own control designs, natural history match data sets, things like that. Because for your average double-blind placebo-controlled trial, you need about 150, 160 patients to pick up an effect size of 0.5. And if you're starting with only 150 patients in the population total, and we all know you never get them all to recruit from that, you're almost dooming some of these studies for failure. So some of it is we've got to shift away from the models we've been using. Some of it is we're starting to study less common conditions. The rare diseases, like I said, like PKU, CF, things like that, are kind of saturated from that standpoint. So it's a blend of factors. It's not that the science is bad. Interestingly enough, the science failure, maybe 20% of the time when we're looking at all those trials. It's usually the fact that the companies run out of runway. It takes a lot longer to get these things going, or they've either been convinced or told they had to use a study model that was just not appropriate for the population they're working on. So it was a longer answer than you might have wanted, but
Right.
It's a complex question.
It is. It really is. And I know that regulators also have their own guidelines. And when you look at their guideline, has eased up and softened quite a bit. So they're not necessarily requiring that double-blind clinical trials. And there still seems to be that gap of maybe some companies are still going back to what traditionally they used to do. Or maybe investigators really kind of pushing that. It's probably not from the advocacy groups, because these patients don't have any other options, and at where they are with the disease stage, still, as long as the drug is safe, they're willing to try anything. And then on the other hand, you also have the investors and the funding of these studies. Or how does this all come play together? Even though the regulators, at least throughout my experience, I feel like they really want to partner with you.
They
and
do.
get the drug across the finish line, but there's so many different things that comes into play.
So definitely the guidance from the leadership at FDA is really saying start embracing these new models, start using these new, well, they're not new methods, just start using methods more appropriate. A lot of this comes down to inertia. There's nothing in the regs or the laws that says the double-blind placebo-controlled trial is, the holy grail of all studies. It's been used as kind of like the golden example, because for large populations with fairly homogeneous populations, it works pretty well. When you get into small heterogeneous populations, it actually falls apart pretty quickly. And then a lot of, if you're on a review panel at FDA, the thing you're probably the most afraid of is being wrong. In other words, letting a drug through that wasn't safe or something like that. So in the absence of kind of partnering with the patients and the sponsor, they'll go to a default more conservative. The other thing we'll see, though, is sponsors. Actually, we have to push a lot of sponsors into looking at more, appropriate designs, just because they've been told the only way to do this is a double-blind placebo control. Interesting story. Do you guys know where the double-blind placebo control started? It's in the 1700s in France. There's a guy named Mesmer from Austria who believed that animals had magnetism, and he brought that to the court of France. And he said people could sense animals by their magnetic fields. And so the king actually commissioned Lavoisier and Ben Franklin to come up with a way to test it. So they actually blinded folks, not really blinded, put blindfolds on them, waved animals around in front of them to see if they could tell, and they couldn't. So that was actually the first kind of randomized control trial that was blinded. Huh. So, and then it came forward from that, and then some TB studies and some other studies in the 1940s really kind of cemented it. But those were for a different population size. So I think the one message, if I get one message across today, is that you need to pick a design that's appropriate for the size of the population you have, and kind of the outcomes you're looking at. The first argument most folks will make is, oh, but what about the placebo effect? Well, one nice thing about a lot of genetic conditions is you have measurable biomarkers.
You do.
And, those really, you can't subjectively change those too much.
Right.
But even when you have subjective biomarkers, there are things you can do, such as extending the time of a trial, because placebo effects fade with time. So there are a lot of things you can do to account for that. But people just kind of wave that as placebo effect, therefore we can't use it. And that's not really true. That's interestingly, another one of the papers Dr. Woodcock and I have coming out on is managing placebo effect in open label trials in rare disease. So we've been kind of trying to think about this and put some things out there on that. That'll be coming out in Clinical Translational Science, and it's open source journal. So folks should be able to get that in a month or two. But no, these things are manageable. People just have to think them through a little bit.
Absolutely agreed. And, in my experience, I don't feel any biotech leader is not thinking it through, or at least doing everything in their power to think it through with the resources that they have available to them. But what I'm hearing in terms of the challenges, I'm kind of hearing three different categories. We have the statistical challenges, which sounds like you've been doing a great job in different models and trying to guide people in these different directions. There's the operational challenges, which there's your group, there's a bunch of groups really working to overcome some of those operational pieces. And then there's a little bit of the institutional in terms of the policy and the infrastructure around it. The piece that I think we might be missing in this discussion so far is really focused on the financial. And when we think about this concept that you kind of raised in different language of like zero-based study design, how do we get to the absolute minimum viable things that we want to measure? In concept, we all want to do that. And we want to lower the burden. We want to be as straightforward on the effect as possible. But on the other side, for most of these biotechs, this is the only asset they have, single shot on goal. They have investors who are looking to hedge their investment and make sure that if there's something to be studied and proven, we are going to prove it. And so you're in this really challenging balance of, if I could design my perfect study to prove that this works, it might only look like this. But if I'm being a great fiduciary of my company, which I'm obligated to do, I might hedge in a few other different ways. So how do you balance the narrative with the investor world and limited capital relative to what you're describing?
That is a fabulous question, and actually one of the more important ones. So here's what you do with that. There's a couple of things. One, when you say you want to use a parsimonious design, that's almost more around the number of patients you're bringing in. For instance, in, say, patient is own control, if I have 20 to 30 patients and I'm looking for an effect size of 0.5, I've actually over-designed that study by almost a factor of 3. So I can actually have confirmation groups within that. The other is using adaptive trial design. This is the other big thing that we push really hard, which is you get into the study, you do a few patients, you look to see, okay, did I pick the right outcome measures? Did I pick the right patient sizes? My design flawed? Things like that. So that very early on, if you need to make course corrections, let's say you have an outcome marker that's just going to be completely unreliable, you can usually tell that pretty quickly. There'll just be no signal at all. So a combination of building in an adaptive phase and, having that built in. So you didn't fail, you just built in so you could change course direction if you needed to make a protocol, rewrite, things like that. And then there is a balancing effect. A lot of folks want one outcome measure. And the problem with that is that's not appropriate for a lot of these diseases that have a lot of heterogeneity. You can have neurologic diseases where some patients have seizures, some patients have neurologic deterioration, some of them have movement disorders. So you have to look at things like compound outcomes, things like that. So it's not that I would, that it has to be one very narrow path. You want to keep the path as wide as you need to. You just want to make sure you haven't added a lot of stuff in there you don't have to. And that's really where I think the adaptive phase can really come in handy there. But it is a balance. I mean, Kim, you're absolutely right. It's a balancing act. No. And most of these studies get one shot.
Right. I think another area that I've noticed that it influences everything throughout the process of the clinical, from the beginning all the way to the end approval, is the access and reimbursement. Right. You try to
Exactly.
design the trial that have the broadest approval
Right.
for the patients, right? And that's what the patients want. That's what the community wants. That's what the clinicians and the investigator wants. That's what the company wants. Everybody kind of align with that. That's what also with the regulators want. But when you also start thinking about access and reimbursement early on in the clinical trial, as you should, right? That influences how you're designing things, what you're
Yes.
measuring, and how you're approaching everything. How do you deal with that? There's just so many different multiple factors that play into this.
So I've been very fortunate that one of the folks I get to work with is Chuck Bucklar, who is head of commercial operations for BioMarin for over 10 years, who had to deal with this on a daily basis. And one of the lessons he taught me is keep it as simple as possible. Said the more things that you have that, drug only works under this condition while you're standing on your left foot holding an ear while blindfolded in your right eye, guess what? The payers are going to latch onto that, and they're only going to pay for folks standing on one foot blindfolded, holding onto one ear. So that's where you try to keep your exclusion criteria minimal. That's one thing you can do from that. You try to make your outcomes as relevant to the clinical situation as possible, given the fact that you also want to have objective outcomes as well, too. So those are a couple of things you can do. The other one is pediatric inclusion. So Ron Bartek and some others run this thing called the Pediatric Inclusion Alliance. And one of the arguments that we make is that you're actually doing yourself a lot of favors by including children early in these studies, because let's face it, 72% of rare disease affects kids. I think that's about the right number. And so if you're not studying kids, first off, you're not studying the most relevant population. Second off, you're more likely to miss a signal. If you start off with adults and it fails, it may just simply be because the disease has kind of run its course and there's no room to get a signal in the adults. So, you've got a high type 2 error, false negative error rate from that standpoint. So the other thing that will happen is, someone will run the trial in adults. It works great. Yay. And then it's approved. And guess what immediately happens in the clinical world? Everyone starts using it off label. So you never actually have both dosing, safety, or demonstrated efficacy in the pediatric population, which then the payers will sort of lean into. And then you'll have this constant, war between them and the clinicians on, well, it worked in this trial. So that's the other thing you can do, is actually include your most relevant population. We call it point of maximal impact. You want to study the drug where it's going to have the biggest impact on the disease, or before it has the big impact on the disease, so that, when you're through, the population you've proven it in is the one you're actually going to be treating in the real world. And I think that's something people are becoming much more aware of, but you're absolutely right. It's an issue.
The other thing that I find related to this, it's not just about the study design itself and what we all fall trapped to, and I feel even in this conversation, 3 of us are falling trapped to this, is the sequential nature. It's like, okay, well, we know how we have to design it. Great. If we can design it a little bit better, if we can get patients engaged and enrolled better, great. Then we're going to think about payers and make sure that we can get access. And we talk a lot about this idea of developing with the end in mind, but especially in rare disease, that feels a little bit backwards, because we have to be so consumed with the idea of what is the journey by which a patient is actually going to be able to consume a solution at the end of this. And that is not just a straight market access equation in the US with a straight payer profile. That is incredibly complex in the global landscape, where we have different reimbursement systems, we have unlicensed products, we have managed access programs, we have MFN running in the US right now. Like, we have so many different contraptions, if you will, to operate within, that we really need to be thinking in the rare disease space about what does true access look like as a starting point. And then I would argue that our study design should mirror the path by which we want to get access. And so if we want to prove that if we want to prove that this patient is going to benefit in this way,
right,
then our study should be designed to prove that. And payers are going to align to it and regulators are going to align to it. But we are very stepwise and linear in how we think about it today versus in rare disease, where I really think we need to be thinking about that last mile first.
Agree with you on that. We've got one problem in rare disease, though, that we have to kind of think about in that regard, which is a lot of the diseases are neurocognitive in nature. And they're either start off with the problem or it slowly develops over time in a time frame that is completely outside the bounds of what a clinical trial can really do in real time. So in those cases, you have to use some form of a surrogate, whether it's a biomarker, things like that. And then you have to convince folks that changing that biomarker is going to impact that long-term neurocognition, which can take 15 to 20 years to do sometimes. So, and, if you look at that problem is getting more rather than less because more of the diseases that are being looked at right now, neurocognition is really, kind of the big thing. And that's a tricky one. The one I will come back and say that the patient has got to be at the center of all of this. They got to be at the center of your design, what your outcomes are you're looking at. They have to be relevant to the patient community, which when they are that actually can line up with the payers and things like that. So when I talk about these different elements, it's not that, you got to consider those things and the patient actually kind of comes at the end of that. No, if you actually put the patient at the middle of it, you're going to increase your success rates. You're going to get a better design, or at least one more appropriate. And payers listen to patients. They will listen to them if the outcomes are relevant to that community. I can't tell you how many times I've had to deal with 6-minute walk tests. And those of you in the rare disease world know what I'm talking about. And we all hate it and the patients hate it too. But finding those outcomes that are relevant, it takes a lot of work. And sometimes you have to use mix and match. You have to use a surrogate and then plan to look at some of the long-term outcomes, things like that. I really wonder if we won't end up with a system where it's more of a conditional approval, which payers will hate. I get that. But where we've shown that we can move the biology, but can we actually move the long-term outcome? But the drug can actually get to the patients, be in the marketplace, but you still have to keep testing it for quite a while to see if it's really doing what you thought it was going to do. That's probably the most objective answer for that. But in the real world, that's also probably one of the toughest.
One of the challenging
to do as well, too.
I absolutely agree with you, but especially in the rare disease, ultra-rare disease, the sooner you get the advocacy groups and patient voice involved in the whole process from the beginning, even your trial design, the better chance that you got as you go through the process to get to a point that they're already kind of part of the team as opposed to kind of thinking afterwards about them. And it's so, so important to do that.
I think there's a huge opportunity here, as we're thinking about all of these different parameters in the rare disease drug development space. We have the core ones that you've been really focusing on uncommon cures around the statistical, operational, institutional, and really moving the needle there. There are some of these broader access challenges that hopefully as an industry globally, we're starting to move the needle. And over the next few years, we'll see more options available to the rare disease community.
That's really well put. I think there's another issue too. The more efficient we can make these clinical trials and reduce the carrying cost of developing a new drug, the more access we're going to see across the international community. If you look at most countries, a lot of folks won't even do clinical trials in places like Great Britain, Canada, and some of the other countries because they know there's not a pathway for coverage. If we can actually find ways to shorten both the development of the materials themselves, but also the trial times, the lengths and things, and you can start to drive those prices down. That's going to really help. That's one of the reasons we started this company, is we were really worried that using the older inefficient model was keeping the prices higher than were affordable by the communities. And so you're seeing a shrinkage in rare disease drug access rather than an increase, at least as far as geography went.
So a critical point and one that, I will say we're spending a lot of time on across the SSI organization right now, trying to figure out how do we expand global access to medicines, period. I think there's a lot of question on where was the drug developed, where was it founded, where was it developed, where is it going to launch, and we're really thinking about this global biotech ecosystem in a very new way over the last few years. I think it's all of our jobs to build more bridges than barriers.
Agreed.
And so wherever the medicine is developed, let's get it to the patient who's going to benefit from it, no matter where that is. And we have to design our studies to allow for that. We need to design our infrastructure to allow for that. And we need to create the opportunities to enable it. And I know that that's something that you guys are doing a lot of work on. We're really looking at some of this development infrastructure to enable it as well, even beyond the rare disease space. But I see huge potential and hopefully a lot of great things coming in the near future.
Well, I think one of the things SSI is doing that I really applaud is you're trying to cut down wasted motion on the part of a lot of these early stage sponsors, because it is a scary field when people come into it and they haven't been in it before. And being able to find someone who knows what they're doing, here's how you go, here's your short path to get to this point here without kind of making all the mistakes. Because I see so many of these young companies, they make the same mistakes everyone else does. And we just can't afford that anymore. We just don't have room for those inefficiencies.
And I think part of it has to do with investors and the funding, especially for smaller companies, right? For bigger companies, they can make few mistakes and it's really not going to hurt their bottom line so much. But for companies that maybe they just got the IPO or they're pre-IPO and they also have this huge investor aspects of it, and they're very vocal, right? They want to make sure that the product and that you're working on and the clinical trial designs and the number of the patients and everything that you're doing, it also gets to the end point. And when it does get to the end point and you do get the approval, what are the number of the patients that actually, benefit from this? Where are these patients? As you know, a lot of these rare disease patients, it's hard to find them, right? Yeah. Because they haven't had, a lot of times these are the first drug coming to the market, first treatment coming to the market. So they haven't had
most of the time, actually.
Most of the time, that's really the case. How have you found that? And this goes back to what I think also Kim was bringing up earlier on, that it's not really a relay race. It's not sequential. You have to be able to think about all of these at once together and kind of move in a coordinated fashion. What have you found to be kind of impactful from that aspect when you're working with some of the companies with regards to that?
One of them is getting them engaged with the patient community from day one. So one of the things we'll recommend, if it's a disease where there does not exist a strong natural history program, what we'll actually do is we'll ask the sponsor saying, you need to fund the patient organization to build a natural history study. And we use the NORDIM Rare program because that was one that the FDA helped fund and build, and it's a really, really rock solid program. There are others, but that's the one we usually use. What does that do? It does a couple of things. One, it gets the sponsor engaged with the patient community in a positive way. Mm-hmm. In other words, the first day they show up is not, we want you to enroll and test our drug. It's like, no, we want to build a natural history study that's going to belong to you. So these studies belong to that. We will have some useful information in it, but it's going to be long. It's going to go past us. So the next therapy that comes along or the next clinical, how do we treat the patients kind of thing that comes along, that will be existing. It does a couple of other things too. It starts to consolidate the patient population by getting folks into those natural history studies. It starts to build the information. You can start to say, what are relevant outcomes? How common is this outcome? How common is that outcome? The other thing it does, and since almost all of these natural histories have reached back to let patients know there's a study going on, you've sort of pre-recruited in some ways, because folks who will participate in a natural history study are probably the ones most likely to participate in an actual clinical trial. So by doing something that's really good for the patient community, you've actually done something that can really boost the success of your trial. And it's kind of a win-win-win-win sort of situation. So when someone's coming in early and the field's very disorganized, there's not a strong patient component yet, that's one of the first things we'll recommend. And I think that's the other thing too, is when a company starts off, they've got a great idea. They're starting to think about their study design, but usually they've got at least a year of getting their product ready for a clinical trial. Sometimes longer, sometimes shorter, depends. If it's a biologic, it can be a lot longer. But that also gives an ongoing project that keeps them engaged with the disease and with the community, and starts to, kind of really get them as part of that group. And like I said, it's a positive thing for the patient community as well, too. So that's one thing we try to do to get people looking at this.
Amazing. Marshall, this has been an amazing discussion. Really appreciate all your incredible insights here. And I think there's a lot of learnings, not just for the rare disease community, but also more broadly in drug development, things that we can learn from rare disease and bring it to other drug development life cycles, but also more broadly how we think about changing the infrastructure around our industry and what's to come. So thank you so much. We're really looking forward to hearing how things continue to progress with the organization.
Thanks for tuning in to the Emerging Biotech Leader, an SSI strategy podcast. Join us each month for more conversations with biotech leaders. If you'd like to help navigating the complexities of biotech, reach out to our team at ssistrategy.com. Don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a review.